I'm Linda Knudsen Westgard talking to my parents about Knudsen Brothers Dairy, which was on Hartford Turnpike in North Haven. The dairy was started by my grandfather Peter and his two brothers Dan and Chris, and was later run by my father Peter Jr. And here's my mom and dad, Peter and Pidgey.
Okay, well, I'm Helen /Pidgey Knudsen.
And I'm Peter Knudsen. The company was Knudsen Brothers Dairy, and there were always the three brothers that were involved in it. We were, along with Brock Hall, we were the two dominant dairies in the greater New Haven area. And then when I was involved, we purchased a couple of companies that were in the dairy business up in the Hartford area. And so we were a pretty, we were probably the largest dairy in the greater New Haven, greater Hartford area for maybe 10 or 20 years. Yeah, it started in the Depression. The three Knudsen brothers all had careers that were away from here, or I guess my father lived here, but he was an electrician. Uncle Dan was a mason, and Uncle Chris was a wholesale dress salesman on the West Coast, and they both found themselves out of work in the Depression, so they came back to their father's farm and started to pasteurize his milk, and then pretty soon, and sell it, and then pretty soon they had more customers than the supply from their father's farm, and so they started buying from other farmers, and that's how the dairy grew. And that's when pasteurization came in. Prior to that, England fever was a common ailment, and that was due to a pathogen that was carried in unpasteurized milk. So it was in the early 30s, that it was recognized that pasteurization was a health benefit for society. Their father farmed until I would say their early 50s, and then he worked for his sons at the dairy, usually in the bottle and case return area, and where they fed the cases of empty bottles to be washed. He kind of supervised that area for his sons. As the dairy expanded and they needed that space where the farm had been, the farm buildings, they eventually knocked down one building after another. Yeah, their sister Eleanor lived out in Illinois, in Galesburg, on a farm there with their husband, Uncle Morris, who met Eleanor when my grandparents provided lodging for him when he came to the United States from Denmark. My grandparents, my grandfather came from the portion of Denmark that's on the North Sea, from Stadilø, which is near Ringkøbing, Denmark, and my grandmother came from the province of Schleswig-Holstein, which is the province that went back and forth between Germany and Denmark, and I think at the time of her leaving there, it was actually under control of Germany. Denmark, of course, borders on Germany.
So back to the dairy. Was it always the same location there on Hartford Turnpike?
Yes, that's where the three brothers' father's farm was located. So it started right there. Although the farm had originally been on Broadway in probably Hamden, and then my grandfather, John, moved to North Haven. And I don't know when that happened, but he bought that farmland and built a house and the farm buildings. When my Uncle Chris was 12, he had a sledding accident that where he hit his right shoulder on something that ripped the nerves out of his arm, so that his right arm became only partially useful. So he was the only one to go on and graduate from high school, and he went to a business school for a little bit. So he naturally became the president, because he was the one with the business, more of the business background, and the other two, my Uncle Dan ran the milk processing side, and my father the ice cream side. Now, my father started with delivering milk when they used horses originally, and then they were involved in the conversion from horses to motorized delivery trucks.
Coming in as an outsider, I was always impressed with the way the brothers cooperated with there was really not any fighting about who did what that I knew of anyways.
No, there was a lot of mutual respect from them, and they would have discussions, but it was interesting to me that the oldest brother, which was Uncle Dan, really was looked up to by the other two, who were fraternal twins, and Uncle Dan was always the big brother who I learned over time was the one who eventually made the decisions for the company.
Do you know when they started with the ice cream part of the business?
I think that was about it was just before the war is when they started to process, I believe, when they started to process some ice cream.
What products do you remember them making? I know it was ice cream and milk, but what else?
Well, they made, in addition to fluid milk products, they made buttermilk, sour cream, cottage cheese. Eventually we made yogurt, and then we made the ice cream products. My father would buy the flavorings from certain suppliers, and he would do that pretty much based on taste. There were a couple of flavors that we were known for that became part of our regular product line: black raspberry, orange pineapple ice cream, and then in the summer we had peach. And the interesting thing, and a lot of people loved the peach ice cream. The interesting thing about peach is that my father discovered that nectarines imparted a peach-like flavor that was really better than peaches themselves. So our peach ice cream was pretty much made with nectarines, but we always called it peach.
Do you remember when Aunt Kate started running the dairy store and how that came about?
Yeah, I remember some managers of the dairy store prior to Aunt Kate, and my guess is that it was around 1960 or so, or maybe the late 50s, even when she started to manage the dairy store, which was unusual. As far as I know, she was the only family member other than Uncle Chris's son Morgan, who went by Mo, and me, who came into and worked at the business. I actually started to work in the dairy store when I was 12. When I was 16 and could drive, I started to do home deliveries and worked for, I think it was 3 summers doing that. And that paid pretty well. I was able to make $150 a week or so, which at that time was a lot of money. And so I saved my earnings and used that as my spend money pretty much for college. My first vacation or person that I relieved had a route in East Haven. And so I'm 16 years old and make a delivery to the back of a home that was a multifamily home. And so you had to go up the stairs in the back, and they had a milk box, at the second level. And as I was making the delivery, a woman opened the door and stood behind the screen door in her underwear and talked to me as if that was a normal thing to do. And then another time when I was on the route, I believe this was in Hamden, I was making a delivery and I hear someone saying, Peter, come. And after a bit, it turned out that she had a dog named Peter. So it took me a bit to figure out that she wasn't calling me. Oh, I should tell you one other funny thing that happened is notes that were funny were posted on the where the drivers checked in was in the basement of the dairy, and so we had a bulletin board there, and if you got a funny note from a customer, they would post it there. And I got one day that I posted that said the customer had moved the milk box out from an enclosed porch, screened-in porch, and put it on the steps. And there was a note that said, "Please don't come onto the porch. My dog is in heat." So that got posted. Oh, it was a normal thing at that point to go into the family business. And so I think that was always fairly attractive to me, I think. And so after college and then after a couple of years in the Navy, I was in NRTC in college. Then after 2 years in the Navy, I went to business school and then went to work at the dairy full time. And worked there for 19 years. I believe it was about 12 of them where I was CEO. The brothers eventually, I've been at the dairy maybe about 7 years when they decided that I should run it. Made a couple of acquisitions and expanded and stuff, and eventually sold the milk side and tried to make a go of the ice cream only side. And we were in what was called at that time the Jimmy Carter interest rates, where interest rates were more than 20% and as much as 24%. And so we had some debt with the bank that really buried us. And so eventually I just had to shut down the ice cream side as well. After I sold the milk side to Marcus Dairy, and that was a pretty good deal. But then, the economy really turned against us. Yeah, the company had at one point as many as 450 employees, and we had 5 Teamster locals that all had individual labor contracts because they were in different areas. And so it was so the typical contract was for 3 years, and so it seemed like there was always a negotiation that was about to start, and some of them were pretty tense. When you have that many employees and you have that much responsibility, it becomes basically an around-the-clock responsibility and a all-consuming kind of effort. And so my typical work day was 8 to 6, and it could go later if there were problems. And it was typically a pretty good part of Saturday as well as the other days in the week. Sunday was generally a day off. We didn't run the plant on Sunday. The plant did run on Saturday, 6 days a week. As you know, cows give milk 7 days a week, so we had to process it or accumulate it. So on Sunday we accumulated the milk and used it over the course of the week.
Mom, did you hear about the issues all along?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Did you have any involvement other than that?
No. No. And as soon as you all started school, I was teaching, so.
As we expanded the ice cream production side, we built a big addition in the 60s that expanded the ice cream production. We sold ice cream from Maine down to Maryland, and so that became a much bigger business, and we needed the space, and so we cut down the dairy store to about half of the size that it had been previously.
And it was a big, the dairy store was really big. I remember anytime I would go shopping down in New Haven when you all were growing up, somebody would see my last name on my credit card or something, and say, "Oh, I used to go to Knudsen's Dairy every Sunday."
Well, today we assume that milk is going to last for a week or two easily in our refrigerators. When we started the dairy, or when my parents and his brothers, my father and his brothers started the dairy, they actually delivered milk 7 days a week because the shelf life of the product was short. And over time we learned more about how to improve both at the farm level and at the dairy level the quality of the milk, so that its shelf life was extended. And as the shelf life became more and more, there was, the typical housewife would buy eventually into the 80s or 90s, would buy a week's supply of milk at the store instead of having home delivery. When we were delivering, every day or every other day, and then we even went to twice a week delivery, we did that because it was a nuisance to have to go to the store to get milk, and milk at that point, like I said, didn't last for a week or two like it does today. And we were one of the leaders, I think, in extending the shelf life and the quality of milk. And we had a program where we analyzed typically both bacteria-wise with tests and flavor-wise milk from the individual farmers where we purchased the milk, so that the farmers, we would communicate back to them so they had information that enabled them to improve the quality of their milk. And for example, you know, if a cow eats onions, that flavor will get carried through the milk. Also, we were very concerned about the use of antibiotics, selfishly, because if antibiotics get into the milk supply, you cannot make cottage cheese out of that. It just won't set. The bacteria that you inoculate the batch or the vat of milk to set up, those bacteria get killed by the antibiotics that a cow may have been treated with. So our farmers learned that they had to, if they had a sick cow that was being treated, that milk got isolated and didn't get sold to us. And so there was even a point at which, you know, the hospitals, the local hospitals, recognized that our milk was pretty much free of antibiotics. Yeah, there was competition between dairies, and you know, there were two main dairies in this area, Bruckall and Knudsen's, that delivered to homes. Seal Test also did, but they pretty much migrated over to concentrating only on serving stores. So it was between Bruckall and Knudsen. So most homes got home delivery.
How about the little cartons that were in the schools? Did you get contracts to do that?
Yeah, you know, every year the schools would bid on the milk supplier, and we would bid on that and win a lot of them and not some others. But that was a pretty competitive business. Yes, we did supply, you know, and we started to supply one of our wholesale customers. There was a Pegnataro food chain in New Haven, and we supplied them. They had 3 or 4 stores, large supermarkets. And then we supplied 7-Eleven, and pretty much throughout Connecticut, all the 7-Eleven stores. But there's been an interesting thing that has happened in the past 10 or 20 years, that the per capita consumption of milk today is
Much less.
about 50% of what it was when we were in the business. And people just don't drink as much milk, you know. It used to be not unusual that especially teenage boys would drink a quart of milk a day. And I remember delivering to families where we would deliver 6 to 12 quarts every other day. So it was very common that people drank a lot of milk, but you don't see that near as much today as you did at that time. And we have a milk box upstairs that we could show you. That's a wooden one, and my father once told me that that was among the earliest milk boxes in the area, and we were the first company to have milk boxes in the area. And it was given to us by a friend of our family, Gene Gillen, who saw it at I guess a flea market and purchased it. Well, this was the wooden one, and you know, even when I delivered milk, the milk boxes, occasionally you'd see a wooden one, but they became metal insulated ones. And you know, when you signed up a new customer, you delivered them a milk box, typically a new one, so they'd be happy with a brand new milk box. Everybody was proud of having a new milk box. And we also had wooden milk cases, and eventually, that changed over to the plastic milk cases that you see today that have become now ubiquitous for storage. It didn't cease being delivered to homes until I would say maybe in the 90s, early 90s. Marcus Dairy, who we sold our fluid milk business to, stayed in the home delivery business for quite a few years after we sold it to them. But interesting enough, the dairy industry, people don't realize this, is an industry with a very high fixed cost. And if you look at, which I learned in business school, if you look at the cost of capital versus the cost of labor, and that's a measure of that can be applied to across all industries. The dairy industry, when you look at that percentage as a percentage of value added, the dairy industry is right there with basic steel. And everybody thinks that basic steel is a capital cost and that's a business. They don't realize that the dairy industry is very capital intensive as well. So there was a lot of incentive for dairies to increase volume and therefore pricing was always a real issue in margins, and the larger national companies would sometimes do crazy things with pricing, where they might bid as little as the cost of milk plus the cost of the carton, and forget about the cost of processing and delivery. So there was really, in some cases there was no contribution from a customer to the overhead operation of the dairy, and that was a recipe for disaster. And I don't think most managers of dairies really recognize the fact that dairies are so capital intensive. The dairy industry, because of that top capital intensive nature of it, is driven toward increasing volume through plants. So consolidation of plants has been a long-term trend in the whole industry, and it's been so there have been fewer and fewer, larger and larger plants, processing plants. And I wouldn't want to even think about what has happened in the last 10 or 20 years with the reduction in per capita consumption, because that is a problem, a real problem, when you're talking about an industry that's so capital intensive. If you start losing volume, that contribution toward your capital costs are reduced, and it makes survival problematic. And a lot of dairies across the country have gone out of business.